Welcome to The Details with Adam Thrower and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the interactions between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world today. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come and examine the details with us. So Cecil, today we are going to talk a little bit about kind of an ongoing experience that's happening here in the United States, but I think also across the globe, really. And it's this idea of inflation. And on the surface, people might wonder, like, what does inflation have to do with solution-focused brief therapy?
Everything. I mean, the cost of me driving here today. That alone.
Of course. So if you were to introduce this intersection of inflation and solution-focused brief therapy, how would you go about doing that?
Well, the connection I see, if you let me take a short walk, it'll make sense. But I think the ups and downs of our systems and the lives in general that people, in a society face are somewhat of a reflection of the values and how we've socially agreed to address what is important to us and how we've agreed to address how we should live and exist and be in a system together. But where I think that the systems we are kind of being occupied, like if we look at the economy or the policies that guide the economy, it could be improved by being restructured in a similar way that we help people in session restructure their lives or the ways that they're going about trying to get the things that they want. And I think there's lots of examples of that. But one of the ways is just, for example, becoming more outcome oriented, being able to say, here's the thing that I want. And now everything else that we talk about and do and notice is going to be in connection to that. I think that structure alone obviously makes a really constructive conversation for the client. And I think it changes the way that they interact with the rest of their lives once they leave that session, gives them new ways of looking at and talking about and thinking about the things that already were pretty important to them before. And so if we applied that factor alone to the economy and the way that, this is really actively affecting people, I think that could start to kind of give people more of what they actually want and give people a way to actually realize some of the things that might be important to us. One of the biggest ways that inflation right now is affecting people, I don't know if it's huge around the world, but definitely in the States right now, the housing market, it's gotten to just an extreme place where it's very difficult for people, low-income people especially, to be able to afford to live where they've probably lived their entire lives. It's just an absurd markup of rent, even though it doesn't seem like, there's an organic reason for that increase in rent. And so if we were to say, we can all agree people deserve to live and have housing and have some sense of safety and security in their housing, if that's the outcome that we're wanting, then we can begin to reorient everything else around that. So like I said, it was a long walk to get there, but I think I like the word I use, structure. I think taking a bit of that quote structure that a solution-focused conversation can provide and applying that to things like housing and other things affected by inflation, I think could make a really positive, meaningful difference.
Yeah, I like what you said. I think as I think about inflation, you mentioned the housing market, right? That prices are soaring, that people who are renting are having a difficult time staying where they're renting. People who have lived in a certain place are getting priced out of that because taxes are going up. But there are other implications, right? So like if you look at gas prices, a lot of people are talking, gas a year ago was around $1.60 per gallon. Now it's close to $5 a gallon.
Good times.
Right. It's a huge increase in 1 year. And there's differing opinions about why that's happening, right? Some people are saying that we aren't utilizing the resources that we have enough. Other people are saying the government is just artificially raising those prices to get a profit, right? Other people are saying corporations, businesses are artificially inflating their costs. So there's lots of different ideas about why we are where we are. And I think similarly, if you look at the housing market, there's different ideas about why we are where we are. But similarly, prices on lots of things are going up. Food, right? There's a scarcity on lots of different foods, and therefore food prices are going up. And so there's a lot of speculation and a lot of, I would say, finger pointing and blaming around like such and such entity is doing this, and therefore all of the prices are going up. And that focus is really on a, why are we in the
Right.
situation that we're in? And I think that from a solution focused perspective, we tend to take a very different perspective, right? Many of the traditional psychotherapy approaches are, how did you get here? What brings you here today? How did that problem become a problem? And there's kind of a pulling apart, or some people will say we're processing it, or there's work to be done before we can move forward. And a solution focused perspective takes an entirely different perspective. And it says, in some sense, it actually doesn't matter how we got here. But what does matter is, where do we want to go? And I think that's kind of what you're talking about in this, is if we start to look at the outcome that we're hoping for, then our behavior can change. And the way that we also, like you mentioned, the policies that we put in place, they can begin to change. And now they're outcome-based policies rather than problem-solving strategies. And so I think, again, like if we were to look at, like you mentioned, housing, right? If we say, so what outcome do we want as far as housing is concerned? We want people to have safe, clean environments to live in, right? Then we start to build backwards from there, and we say, okay, so how do we ensure that everyone has a safe place to live? And that changes the policies around who can live where. It changes the policies around how do we regulate safety? It, all of those kinds of things. If we look at gas prices, right, and we say, okay, so what outcome do we want from gas? We want people to be able to get to their needed destinations, again, safely, in a way that's economical, right? And one of the things that I think is consistent when we take that future outcome-oriented perspective is that oftentimes, or I guess I would argue, that people should become the outcome, enhancing people's lives, making their lives better, providing safety for people. People become the outcome that we measure, not profit, not income, not, lots of other things that I think are happening now. And so I think taking that different perspective could dramatically shift a lot of the courses of action that we're taking.
Right. And I think what happens in doing that, when you say we're going to turn ourselves to pay attention towards where is it that we want to go, rather than getting stuck in this conversation of how did we get here, which I think frames a lot of political discourse and a lot of contentious discussion about current events, that frames it really, really accurately. But what happens when we turn towards where is it that we want to go, you have to wade through all the things that are in the air, all the content that's surrounding you, and say, well, here's what's actually important. And we see that happen with clients, right? Like they're living whatever kind of lives that they're living. They're dealing with anxiety, depression, conflicts in their relationships. And somehow in the process of saying, well, what I really needed was some confidence in myself. That's what I actually want. If I were to wake up tomorrow with confidence in myself, here's all the different changes that could happen. Here's all the things that I could see. And I feel like that metaphorically clears the board a bit. It wipes away all these other things that might be circulating around in their minds and in their lives. And they can say, well, if I show up as this confident person, here's how all the details start to pull together. And I can actually move towards what I want, rather than the usual distractions of, just the disorganization of however they're seeing their lives, whatever they're dealing with on a usual basis.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think about what you were talking around like the political arena, right? So much of what's happening now, especially here in the United States, is both political parties, in essence, they're choosing courses of action to maintain power, right? So it isn't the outcome that they're hoping for is to stay in power.
Right.
And that influences what's happening and the decisions that are going on, how they vote for particular policies, whether they vote for particular policies, those kinds of things. And so in that perspective, they're shooting for one outcome that I would argue is actually not a very valuable outcome. Right. And I think that's an important component to think about as well, whether that's kind of at that large scale or whether it's in our individual lives, is the importance of choosing your outcomes purposefully. I think they've chosen purposefully, they've chosen to maintain power
Mm-hmm.
wherever possible. But I think in our lives, if we look at maybe something very similar, maintaining power, we begin to treat people in our lives differently. Perhaps I would probably argue not as good if the outcome is helping people feel loved, helping people feel valued,
Exactly.
And so simply by purposefully choosing outcomes, it really can change the course that we're on. And I think that that's something that you were kind of getting at too, is when people come to therapy, one of the most important things we can do in a therapy setting is to say, regardless of how you got here,
Right.
what is that very most valuable outcome that you want to move toward? And then clarity starts to come as they start to describe, if they were moving in the direction of that outcome, what would be different? And all of these little tiny things start to add up to now achieving that outcome can become a reality. And I think that's the other thing is some people listening might think, yeah, this is really idealistic of like choose an outcome and then all the policies will change. And I would say we see it at an individual level that reality really does change. These little tiny changes occur and they add up to that outcome becoming a reality. And I think we have to put trust that that would also work on a larger scale, that if each one of us held our representatives accountable for an outcome that involved the betterment of people, then we would start voting differently and they would start behaving differently. And those little changes can add up to, we're no longer in an economy that is run amok with inflation, because now we're moving toward betterment of people rather than accumulation of wealth.
Right. And I'm glad you framed it that way, because I do think it absolutely would work on a larger systemic level. What happens when you find an outcome that you're trying to move towards is it creates a new currency. Like you said before, if the outcome in place that's being used by these politicians is maintain power, currency, so to speak, for them is they need to do things that look really, really good or look like might earn them some votes or make them look like a hero in some sense. But if the outcome was prosperity for, people across groups and divisions, everyone in general having security and safety and some type of access to decent housing and all those things, the currency then is the well-being of people, right? That's how good is this going to be for people? That's how we're measuring everything now. And I think we see similar things with clients as well. If the outcome is, I want peace, then they start measuring things and how much peace that might bring them. For some people, if the outcome is, better relationships, they start looking at their decisions for how good is this for our relationships, for my family and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up. Oftentimes what we do to wrap it up is to kind of give people something to think about or go do or whatever. And I think that's I guess that's what I would ask people to do, is to think about, if our economy wasn't rising in inflation everywhere we look, but if we were moving toward an outcome that was desirable, what would that be? And then I would say, let's hold each other accountable to that. Let's start voting consistent with that outcome that we want. Let's start asking our representatives. So if you identify an outcome that's consistent or inconsistent with what your representative is voting for, reach out and let them know. Let's start adding those tiny little changes together. And that's how we're going to change the course of this process.
I would love to see that.
Me too.
This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.